The Japanese destroyer's searchlight swept across the surface of the sea like a deadly claw. It passed just meters off our bow, and we held our breath, engines off, drifting in the darkness near Vella La Vella. 23 American sailors pressed flat against the deck of PT 164, doing everything we could to melt into the night. In the holds of the 3 Japanese transports behind that destroyer, nearly 8,000 enemy soldiers had no idea their journey to reinforce Kolombangara would end in the black waters of the Solomon Sea. It was July 19th, 1943, and in just 4 minutes, we would unleash hell from the dark. My fingers clamped the twin mount of the 50 caliber machine guns so hard my knuckles ached. Beside me, Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderbird murmured the coordinates to our commander, Lieutenant Commander Arthur M. McPhersonson. The green glow of the compass was the only light we allowed ourselves. Behind us, hidden in the moon shadow cast by Vella La Vella's volcanic peaks, PT 168 and PT 171 waited for our signal. We were America's concealed weapons, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to learn the night no longer belonged to them. My name is Chief of the Boat Thomas Tom Harrigan, United States Naval Reserve, and I was one of the pioneers who proved that small wooden boats could send steel ships to the bottom. People ask me all the time what it was like to be part of the best-kept naval secret of 1943. The truth is, we were too busy fighting to stay alive to think about making history. We only knew that if we failed that night, those 8,000 Japanese would reach Kolombangara and massacre American boys trying to seize that vital airfield. Every torpedo we carried meant hundreds of American lives potentially saved. Every enemy transport sunk meant families back home who wouldn't receive that dreaded telegram from the War Department. To understand how 3 craft smaller than luxury yachts could challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its power, you have to understand what we were up against in the summer of 1943. The Japanese had turned night fighting into an art. Since their victory at Savo Island the year before, when they sank 4 Allied cruisers without losing a single ship, they owned the darkness in the Solomons. Their sailors had trained for years to fight without radar, relying only on sharp eyesight and flawless coordination. They called their nightly supply runs the Tokyo Express, and we called it the Rat Run. Either way, they moved troops and materiel with almost no opposition after sunset. The U.S. Navy had bigger ships, better radar, and more firepower. But we were losing the war of the night. Our admirals, schooled in classic battle line tactics from Jutland and Manila Bay, weren't adapting fast enough to this new kind of fight. Our cruisers and destroyers, built for fleet actions in open seas, became easy targets in the tight waters of the Solomons. We needed something unexpected, something the Japanese wouldn't anticipate. That something was being built in secret yards from New Orleans to New York, and it would change naval warfare forever. The PT boat, Patrol Torpedo Boat, was born from American desperation and ingenuity. 80 feet long and 20 wide, made of laminated mahogany plywood, not steel. 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines, adapted from Liberty aircraft engines, pushed us past 45 knots, outrunning any torpedo boat or conventional warship. We carried 4 21-inch torpedo tubes with Mark 13s, a 20mm Oerlikon cannon, 50 caliber machine guns, and enough ammunition for about 15 minutes of fury. After that, you ran, or you sank. Saw a PT boat for the first time in February 1943 at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. I was a destroyer sailor fresh off convoy duty in the North Atlantic when the Navy asked for volunteers for dangerous service on experimental craft. The recruiter wouldn't say what they were, only that the expected casualty rate was over 50%. Out of 200 candidates, they chose 40. I signed up because I could navigate by the stars and had small boat experience on Chesapeake Bay. When I first stepped onto PT 164, I thought the Navy had lost its mind. This wasn't a warship, it was a racing boat with delusions of grandeur. Wooden hull, wood in a war of steel and armor. The berthing spaces were so cramped that hot bunking wasn't an option, it was the rule. No armored protection beyond thin plates around the bridge. One solid hit from anything bigger than a rifle bullet, and we'd turn into floating splinters. But then I met McPhersonson, and everything changed. Mac was 28, old by PT standards, with eyes that had already seen too much. He survived Pearl Harbor on the destroyer USS Shaw, fought at Midway, and volunteered for PTs because, in his words, "I'm tired of being the target. Now I'm the hunter." Mac understood something it took us weeks to absorb. PTs didn't fight like normal ships. We were sea gorillas, floating assassins who struck from ambush and vanished before the enemy could react. Saw a PT boat for the first time in February 1943 at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. I was a destroyer sailor fresh off convoy duty in the North Atlantic when the Navy asked for volunteers for dangerous service on experimental craft. The recruiter wouldn't say what they were, only that the expected casualty rate was over 50%. Out of 200 candidates, they chose 40. I signed up because I could navigate by the stars and had small boat experience on Chesapeake Bay. When I first stepped onto PT 164, I thought the Navy had lost its mind. This wasn't a warship, it was a racing boat with delusions of grandeur. Wooden hull, wood in a war of steel and armor. The berthing spaces were so cramped that hot bunking wasn't an option, it was the rule. No armored protection beyond thin plates around the bridge. One solid hit from anything bigger than a rifle bullet, and we'd turn into floating splinters. But then I met McPhersonson, and everything changed. Mac was 28, old by PT standards, with eyes that had already seen too much. He survived Pearl Harbor on the destroyer USS Shaw, fought at Midway, and volunteered for PTs because, in his words, "I'm tired of being the target. Now I'm the hunter." Mac understood something it took us weeks to absorb. PTs didn't fight like normal ships. We were sea gorillas, floating assassins who struck from ambush and vanished before the enemy could react. Our crew was a collection of eccentrics and specialists who would never have served together on a regular ship. Dutch Vandenberg, our exec, was a Yale math professor who could calculate torpedo firing solutions in his head faster than anyone with a slide rule. Chief Machinist Carlos "Charlie" Mendoza built racing engines in Los Angeles before the war and made our Packards purr or roar on demand. Radio man William Sparks Patterson came from submarines, where he learned to run radio in absolute silence. Our torpedo man, gunner's mate Patrick "Patty" O'Brien, was an artist with those mechanical fish. Each Mark 13 weighed a ton and cost a fortune. Patty treated them better than some men treat their wives, adjusting, cleaning, and talking to them. "These beauties," he'd say, as he polished the bronze propellers, "are the only reason the Japs take us seriously. One shot, one kill, or we're just expensive targets." The rest of our 12 men included 2 more gunners, an engineer, a cook who doubled as a medic, and 3 deckhands who did everything. Black and white, city boys and farm boys, illiterate and college educated, united by one detail: all volunteers who knew we probably wouldn't survive the war. Training at Melville was brutal and relentless. The Navy had learned from early losses that enthusiasm wasn't enough. We had to be faster, smarter, and fiercer than anything the Japanese could throw at us. We practiced high-speed attack runs until we could hit torpedoes bouncing in waves at 40 knots. We learned to navigate by sound and instinct when tropical storms wiped visibility to zero. Above all, we learned to think like pirates, not traditional sailors. Commander James "Wild Jim" Patterson, who ran the program, survived the Philippines campaign and escaped Corregidor on one of the last PTs out. His philosophy was simple. The Japanese expect you to fight clean. Don't. They expect you to follow naval tradition. Ignore it. They expect you to fear the dark. Make them fear it. He taught us our greatest weapons weren't the torpedoes. They were surprise, speed, and sheer audacity. We reached our forward base at Renova on June 30th, 1943, just as the invasion of New Georgia began. The base was primitive, a fuel dump, camouflaged Quonset huts, and a rough pier under palm trees. First thing that hit you was the smell. Rotting vegetation. Diesel. Tropical decay. Second was the distant thunder of artillery on New Georgia, where Marines were dying for the airfield at Munda. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9 had 12 PTs tasked with blocking Japanese reinforcements in the Central Solomons. The mission sounded straightforward. Patrol the waters between enemy bases and sink anything flying the rising sun. Reality was far messier. Reef-choked waters, volcanic islands, and hidden Japanese strongpoints. The enemy used seaplanes for reconnaissance, coast watchers on every large island, and destroyer squadrons trained specifically to hunt PTs. Our first patrol on July 5th was a disaster. 3 boats, including ours, tried to intercept the convoy near Viju. We were spotted by an enemy seaplane before we could set up the attack. Suddenly, 4 destroyers were charging us with searchlights blazing and guns firing. We scattered like rabbits, racing between shell splashes. PT-158 took a direct hit from a 5-inch shell and disintegrated. 12 men vanished in an instant. We spent 4 hours dodging reefs and islands before we escaped. 0 torpedoes fired, 0 damage to the enemy. 1 total loss. Hat night at Renova, Mac gathered us. Today we learned something essential, he said quietly. We can't fight them the way destroyers fight. We're not built for gunnery duels. We ambush or we don't attack. It was a hard lesson paid in blood, but it shaped every mission after. Over the next 2 weeks, we developed new tactics by trial and error. We used the radar shadows of islands to hide our approach. We discovered that shutting down 2 engines and running on 1 drastically reduced noise. Most importantly, we coordinated multi-boat attacks using simple light signals the Japanese couldn't intercept. The intelligence network was impressive. Australian coast watchers hidden in the hills of occupied islands radioed ship movements. Native islanders, risking execution, paddled canoes out to us with information on Japanese positions. Sometimes we received decrypted data from Pearl Harbor with exact convoy times, but most nights we hunted on instinct and experience. In July 1943, PT boats were still a secret weapon. Official Navy communications never used the name, only small craft or mosquito boats. The Japanese knew something was attacking their convoys, but early reports blamed submarines or mines. They didn't believe Americans would send fast wooden boats against steel ships. That disbelief was our greatest advantage. On the night of July 18th, Coast Watchers reported a major reinforcement convoy passing through Blackett Strait toward Villa on Colombangara. It was the target we'd been waiting for. multiple transports with minimal escort, forced to thread narrow waters where numbers wouldn't help. Mac volunteered to lead with PT 168 under Lieutenant Henry Hank Bramwell and PT 171 under Lieutenant Joseph Joey Antonelli. The briefing was tense. Intelligence estimated 3 large transports escorted by 1 or 2 destroyers carrying elements of the Japanese 13th Regiment elite troops who had fought in China and the Philippines. These weren't construction battalions. These were frontline fighters who would make our Marines' lives hell on New Georgia. Commander William Bill Specht, squadron leader, didn't mince words. Gentlemen, that convoy cannot reach Vila. I don't care if you have to ram the transports. They go down tonight. At sunset on July 19th, as the sky turned blood red over the Solomons, we made our final preparations. Patty O'Brien checked the torpedo list for the 5th time, setting the Mark 13S for a 10 foot depth and 28 knot speed, ideal for loaded transports. Charlie Mendoza tuned the engines to the edge, fitting mufflers to cut noise. Dutch Vanderberg recalculated the attack track again and again, accounting for current, wind, and moon position. I checked my machine guns one last time, making sure the belts fed cleanly. We loaded only armor-piercing incendiary. Regular rounds were useless against steel, but API could punch through bridge windows, start fires, and neutralize enemy crews. Every 5th round was tracer, drawing lines of fire like fireworks in the night sky. At 20:30, we cast off and slipped into the deepening dark. The 3 boats moved in column, engines muffled to a low rumble. Leaving Renova Harbor, Mac ordered a weapons test. The night briefly erupted as 12 machine guns and 320mm cannons spat fire into the empty sea. Then silence again, only the steady pulse of engines and the whisper of water along the hull. The sea was rougher than we wanted, with a 2-foot swell that would complicate torpedo accuracy. But it also made our wakes harder to see and masked engine noise. Every advantage mattered when you were 80 feet of wood attacking 400 feet of steel. Around 2300, we reached our ambush position north of Villa La Villa. Mac throttled down to idle and we drifted in the darkness, waiting. All we heard was water slapping the hull and the distant rumble of artillery on New Georgia. Then, at 2347, Sparks Patterson picked up a Coast Watcher transmission. 3 big ships, 2 escorts bearing 280, speed 18 knots, distance 15 miles from your position. The hunt began. Mac brought 2 engines online at low RPM as we moved to intercept. The math was clear and deadly. The enemy convoy held 18 knots on a steady course. We could make 35 without throwing an excessive wake. Positioned right, we'd catch them in the narrowest part of Blackett Strait, with no room to maneuver. At 0018 on July 20th, Dutch spotted them through binoculars. Dark silhouettes against a starry sky, exactly where predicted. The Japanese held perfect formation. 2 destroyers in front, 3 transports behind, another destroyer closing the rear. No lights, but the size and spacing made them easy to track if you knew where to look. Mac's plan was simple and insanely risky. PT 168 would strike from the left, PT 171 from the right, and we would drive straight up the middle behind the lead transport. It meant threading between escorting destroyers, sowing through death on both sides. But if it worked, we'd create maximum confusion and get clean shots at all 3 transports. Easy ahead, Mac whispered. We crept forward at 5 knots, nearly stationary, letting the convoy come to us. At 2,000 yards, we could hear their engines, the deep diesel rumble pushing thousands of tons. At 1,500 yards, we could see details, the pagoda bridge of the lead destroyer, cargo cranes on the transports, figures moving on deck. At 1,000 yards, Mac gave the signal. 3 clicks over the radio, and all 3 PTs accelerated together. Our engines roared from idle to full power in seconds, the bow lifting as we hit attack speed. The night cracked open as we charged at 40 knots into the enemy convoy. 3 small craft defying steel giants. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Their lookouts, trained to detect submarines or destroyers, never expected attackers so fast and so close. We were inside the formation before they could react. Slipping between escorting destroyers at point-blank range, I opened up with my twin .50S, sweeping the bridge of the nearest destroyer, watching tracers punch through glass and ricochet off steel. Fire 1. Fire 2. Patty launched our first 2 Mark 13S at 600 yards, an absurdly short range where missing was almost impossible. The torpedoes leapt from the tubes and dove, propellers spinning, leaving phosphorescent bubble trails. The first hit the transport just after the bridge in an explosion that lit the night like lightning. The second struck midships, breaking the ship in half instantly. The 8,000-ton transport heaved, cracked, and began to sink. In the glare of searchlights and gunfire, we saw hundreds of Japanese soldiers tumbling into the water, their screams audible even over our engines. PT 168 struck next. Its 2 torpedoes slammed into the second transport, loaded with ammunition and fuel for the Vila garrison. It erupted like a volcano. The blast was so powerful, it threw me to the deck, and a wave of superheated air rolled over our boat. Flaming debris rained down around us, starting fires on our wooden deck that we stomped out in frantic desperation. The Japanese destroyers were reacting now, but they faced an impossible problem. We were too close for their main guns to depress enough, and we were tangled among their own transports. Firing was risky. They tried to ram us, using their size to crush us. The nearest destroyer turned hard toward us, its sharp bow aimed at our side. At our combined speeds, we had maybe 10 seconds before impact. Mac spun the wheel and shoved the throttles to the limit. Our engines protested, but we danced aside, missing the enemy bow by less than 3 meters. As we passed, I emptied an entire belt into their bridge at point-blank range, sparks flying off the steel. PT 171 wasn't as lucky. Joey Antonelli had lined up perfect shots on the third transport, but a Japanese destroyer caught them in its searchlight before launch. Enemy 25mm fire hammered PTA 171. Punching through the bow, 1 round struck a torpedo, but by miracle, it didn't detonate. The warhead needed to spin in the water to arm. Even so, Joey had to abort and run, trailing smoke and taking on water. We swung back for another attack, but the surprise was gone. Every searchlight in the convoy swept the sea, guns of all calibers firing in every direction. The water around us looked like a hailstorm with so many shell splashes. Worse, the Japanese were finally using their 5-inch guns. One hit from those would turn us into splinters. "Loose the remaining fish and get the hell out!" Mac shouted over the chaos. Patty fired our last 2 Mark 13s at the remaining transport, but the enemy captains saw the wakes and turned parallel, combing the tracks. The torpedoes slid harmlessly past the sides. Then we ran, 3 engines wide open, zigzagging through shell splashes into the darkness. Behind us, the battle continued. PT 168, despite taking multiple hits, managed to plant another torpedo into the second transport as it was already sinking. Secondary explosions from the ammo ship lit the entire strait as it went under. Two of the three transports vanished, taking roughly 6,000 Japanese soldiers with them. The third transport and the destroyers escaped intact, but shaken. We regrouped 5 miles south of the area. All three boats were battered, but afloat. PT 171 was worst, with holes at the waterline and one engine dead. We closed in and transferred the wounded while carpenters improvised plugs from mattresses and life jackets. PT 168 had lost its radio antenna and suffered shrapnel damage, but remained operational. Our boat escaped with minimal damage. Shrapnel holes, one machine gun barrel burned out from overheating, and marks from near misses. But we were alive, and we'd done the job. Two transports sunk for sure, thousands of enemy dead, and the Japanese reinforcement schedule thrown into chaos. The surviving transport, instead of continuing to Vila, turned back for Rabaul. The return to base was tense. Japanese seaplanes rose at dawn searching for us. We hid in the shadows of small islets, camouflaged with palm fronds, engines off, barely breathing as enemy aircraft buzzed overhead. It took us 14 hours to do what should have taken 3, but we all made it back to Renova. The debriefing was relentless. Intelligence officers wanted every detail: Japanese tactics, weapon effectiveness, enemy reaction time. What we reported would be sent to every PT squadron in the Pacific. The lessons of that night would save American lives and sink enemy ships for the rest of the war. But the immediate impact was bigger. Radio intercepts showed Japanese communications referring to a new American secret weapon and high-speed torpedo boats appearing from nowhere. For the first time, the Imperial Navy feared the night. They could no longer move freely in darkness or guarantee safe passage even for better escorted convoys. Very shadow could hide a PT boat. Every sound could be American engines closing in. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese changed their entire resupply strategy. Convoys became larger but less frequent. Destroyer escorts doubled, tripled. They began using seaplanes with searchlights for night reconnaissance. Every change meant fewer supplies and reinforcements reaching island garrisons, giving our ground forces critical advantages. The psychological impact may have outweighed the tactical. Japanese soldiers waiting for reinforcements that never arrived began to lose hope. Enemy commanders, without reliable deliveries, canceled offensives. The myth of Japanese night invincibility, shattered by wooden boats crewed by American teenagers and reservists, began to crumble across the Pacific. Our squadron's success accelerated the expansion of the PT program. New bases sprang up in the Solomons and New Guinea. Improved boats with better engines, radar, and armored protection were rushed into production. The tactics we developed in practice became official doctrine taught from Rhode Island to California. The price of that success was measured in friends who didn't come back. 2 weeks after our successful strike, PT 166 hit a mine returning from patrol. All hands lost. PT 162 was caught by Japanese destroyers in daylight after an engine failure. They blew her apart with gunfire. Only 3 survivors pulled from the water. Joey Antonelli, skipper of PT 171, was killed by a sniper while refueling at an advanced base. By October 1943, when I was rotated back to the United States to train new construction, our squadron had lost 7 boats and 73 men, but we sank or damaged more than 40 Japanese vessels, from destroyers to barges, and killed thousands of enemy soldiers who never reached their destination. The exchange rate was brutal, but necessary. Every PT lost was replaceable. Japanese ships and experienced crews were not. I returned to the Pacific in March 1944 as executive officer of PT 321 in the Philippines. The boats were better. Radar, armor around the cockpit, more reliable torpedoes, but the essence remained the same: speed, surprise, and audacity. We kept proving American innovation could overcome any enemy advantage. The Japanese never fully adapted to the PT threat. They tried everything: special hunter-killer groups, destroyers with radar, even suicide boats meant to ram us. But they couldn't be everywhere, protect every convoy, or make the night safe again. The secret weapon they understood too late permanently changed the balance in the Pacific. McPherson survived the war, earning the Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars. He stayed in the Navy, commanding a destroyer squadron in Korea. We kept in touch until his death in 1987. At his funeral, his son told me Matt used to say PT boats were where he learned what real courage was. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Dutch Vanderberg went back to Yale after the war, but he never forgot the navigation lessons of the Solomons. He became one of America's leading oceanographers, using the same sharpened instincts that once dodged Japanese destroyers to map ocean currents and undersea mountains. He once told me that after threading between enemy warships at 40 knots in the dark, everything else felt easy. Charlie Mendoza went back to building racing engines in Los Angeles, applying the tricks he learned keeping Packards alive to make cars fly. His shop became legendary, with a sign out front, "Speed Shop, we made PT boats fly." He'd tell customers that if you could push 50 tons at 45 knots with 4,500 horsepower, you could make anything fast. Patty O'Brien stayed in the Navy, becoming one of the service's top torpedo experts. He wrote the Mark 13 maintenance manual used into the 70s. But he never forgot the torpedoes he launched that night off Bella Lavella. "Those were my fish that sank those transports," he'd say with pride. 2 shots, 2 hits, 6,000 Japanese who never killed Americans. The story of the PT boats is often overshadowed by the big battles of World War II, Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf. But for those of us who served on those tiny wooden warriors, we knew we were part of something revolutionary. We proved technology and courage could beat tradition and size. We showed that American sailors, many who had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor, could outplay the best Navy in the world at its own game. The real secret of our success wasn't the boats themselves, though they were marvels of engineering. It wasn't the torpedoes when they worked. Devastating as they were, the real secret was the American spirit of innovation, the willingness to try something completely different when conventional methods failed. While our admirals initially dismissed PTs as toys, junior officers and enlisted men proved that toys with teeth could change the course of a war. Every time I read about modern naval warfare, missile boats, stealth technology, asymmetric conflict, I see the legacy of those PT boats. We proved naval combat didn't have to be battleships trading broadsides at 20,000 yards. It could be speed and stealth, hit where the enemy didn't expect, then vanish before the response. Every fast attack craft in today's Navy carries the DNA of those plywood boats that terrified the Japanese fleet. The Japanese phrase that entered their naval vocabulary in 1943 was simple: terror of the mosquito boats, a fear that spread through the fleet. Post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers revealed PT boats caused disruption far beyond our actual numbers. They had to assume we were everywhere, plan for attacks that might never come. Waste resources defending against shadows. Admiral Tanaka Raizo, who commanded many Tokyo Express runs, wrote after the war, "The American PT boats were our worst nightmare. Submarines we could hunt with depth charges, aircraft we could see coming, but these devil boats appeared from nowhere, struck like snakes, and disappeared into the night. They made us fear our own element, the darkness we once dominated. That fear, the uncertainty we created, was worth more than any number of ships sunk. It marked the turning point when the Imperial Japanese Navy, dominant in the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, began to doubt itself. When sailors trained their whole lives for night combat started fearing shadows, the psychological battle was already won. The technical evolution of PT boats during the war was remarkable. The early ones, like ours, were peacetime designs forced into combat. By 1945, PTs carried radar, rockets, advanced torpedoes, and even primitive guided missiles. But the central idea never changed. Small, fast, lethal, crewed by volunteers willing to take insane risks for their country. A story that captures the PT spirit happened in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. A squadron of PTs, absurdly outgunned, attacked the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. Their torpedoes couldn't penetrate Yamato's armor, but they attacked anyway, forcing the giant to maneuver evasively and buying time for American escort carriers to escape. The small boats didn't sink the monster that day, but their courage saved American lives. PT bases became legends: Renova, Tulagi, Mios Wendy, exotic names that meant mosquitoes, malaria, and midnight missions. They weren't Pearl Harbor or San Diego with officers' clubs and clean sheets. They were muddy holes where we lived on canned rations and cigarettes, where mail took months, where the only entertainment was poker and rumors. But morale stayed high because we knew we were making a difference. The Solomon Islanders deserve special mention. They risked everything to help us, guiding us through reefs, rescuing downed pilots and shipwrecked sailors, bringing information about Japanese movements. Many were executed if caught aiding Americans. Their courage and sacrifice were essential to our success. Without them, we would have been blind in those island labyrinths. The Coast Watchers, lonely volunteers, hidden on occupied islands with radios and binoculars, were our guardian angels. They warned of 40 bombers inbound or destroyer squadrons racing south at high speed. Their alerts often saved our bases from surprise attacks or positioned us for perfect ambushes. We never met most of them, but we owed them our lives. One technological advance that revolutionized PT operations was radar. Early sets were so crude they could barely distinguish an island from a ship. But by late 1944, we tracked targets in total darkness and fog. The Japanese, who relied on superior night vision and training, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. We could see them before they saw us, the ultimate advantage in night combat. Our tactics kept evolving. We learned to use strips of aluminum foil to confuse Japanese radar. We developed wolf-pack tactics, coordinating attacks from multiple directions. We figured out how to use coastal batteries as distractions, forcing the enemy to reveal positions by firing at decoys while we maneuvered for the real strike. The most dangerous missions were the ones nobody heard about, inserting Coast Watchers behind enemy lines, evacuating Marines trapped on surrounded beaches, hauling ammunition to isolated outposts under fire. They weren't glamorous torpedo attacks, but hard, deadly work that saved countless lives. We became the Navy's Swiss Army knife, used for any mission too dangerous or too crazy for conventional ships. Personal relationships on PT boats were unlike anything else in the military. On a destroyer with 300 men, you might not know everyone's name. On a PT with 12, you knew everything. Who snored, who had nightmares, who got seasick, who held steady when hell arrived. That intimacy forged bonds for life. Our PT reunions decades later felt like family gatherings because that's what we were. A family forged in combat. The food on PTs deserved its own complaint. We lived on K rations, Spam, powdered eggs, and whatever we could trade for from bigger ships. Fresh water was precious, rationed only for drinking. We washed in salt water that left crystals irritating our skin. Black coffee strong enough to hold up a wrench was our fuel. Some crews got creative, fishing with hand grenades or trading torpedo alcohol for real food with base personnel. Maintenance was constant and vital. Salt water corroded everything. Tropical heat rotted wood and fabric. High-speed operations stressed every part to the limit. We spent more time repairing boats than fighting in them. Every man became a mechanic, carpenter, and electrician out of necessity. A PT with a dead engine in enemy waters was a death trap, so we treated maintenance like religion. The Solomon climate was a constant enemy. Tropical storms appeared out of nowhere, turning calm seas into mountains of water. Lightning could fry radios and electrical systems. Heat and humidity were so oppressive, men fainted at their posts. But bad weather also helped, hiding us from enemy aircraft and making it harder to spot our small boats between rough waves. Navigation in those waters demanded skills not taught at Annapolis. Charts were often wrong, based on 19th century surveys. Coral reefs shifted after storms. We learned to read watercolor and wave patterns, to smell land before we saw it, to navigate by instinct when instruments failed. Every successful patrol added to our mental map of those lethal waters. The Japanese response to PTs evolved throughout the war. They developed shallow draft destroyers just to hunt us. They created coordinated search patterns with seaplanes and destroyers working together. They even tried using captured PTs as bait. But for every countermeasure they built, we built a countermeasure. It became deadly chess at 40 knots in the dark. One rarely discussed aspect was the psychological cost. Living always on the edge, knowing any patrol could be your last, watching friends die in horrific ways. It marked all of us. Some broke and asked for transfers even if it meant being branded a coward. Others became addicted to the adrenaline, volunteering for riskier missions. Most of us just endured, finding ways to live with fear that never truly went away. The humor that emerged was dark, but necessary. We named boats things like Sudden Death, Hell's Angels, Grim Reaper. We painted cartoon characters on torpedoes. Donald Duck riding a torpedo was popular. We made up songs about sinking Japanese ships. The more macabre, the better. It was psychological armor, how we made the unbearable bearable. The impact of PT boats reached beyond the Pacific. When planners prepared the Normandy invasion, PTs were included to protect the fleet from German E-boats. Lessons from the Solomons were applied in the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and even European rivers. American PT doctrine influenced naval thinking worldwide, inspiring similar programs in dozens of navies. Looking back decades later, I'm amazed we survived. We were kids playing with deadly toys in a war that killed millions. We made mistakes that should have gotten us killed. We took risks that still give me chills. But we also achieved something extraordinary. We took an unproven concept and turned it into a war-winning weapon. We proved American innovation and courage could overcome anything. The PT legacy lives on in today's Navy. Every fast attack boat, every special operations craft, every vessel designed to strike quickly and vanish carries the DNA of those original mosquito boats. The sailors who crew them may not know about the nights off Vela La Vela or the terror we brought to Japanese convoys, but they are spiritual descendants, carrying on the tradition of speed, surprise, and audacity. And people ask if I'm proud of my service. I tell them about the night of July 20th, 1943. 3 small wooden boats attacked a major enemy convoy and sent thousands of Japanese soldiers to the bottom. We came out of the darkness, just like the title suggests, and disappeared before the enemy could react. We were America's secret weapon, and we changed the course of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese were stunned not only by our boats, but by what they represented. America's willingness to innovate, adopt aggressive tactics, and risk everything on an unproven concept. They had studied our Navy for decades, battleships and carriers, traditions and tactics, but they never imagined we'd send fast wooden boats armed with torpedoes against their steel ships. That failure of imagination cost them dearly. In the end, the PT story is a typically American story. We took a British concept, powered it with Packard aircraft engines, armed it with destroyer torpedoes, and crewed it with civilians who had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, because we made it work through sheer determination and ingenuity. The last operational PT was retired in 1959, replaced by newer, faster, more capable craft. But for those of us who served on them in World War II, they will always be the boats that won the war in the Pacific. We proved size doesn't define victory, that courage matters more than armor, and that American sailors in wooden boats could defeat anyone, anywhere, anytime. As I finish this account, sitting in my office surrounded by faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, I can still hear those Packard engines roaring in the night. I can still feel the spray of the Solomon Sea on my face, still smell cordite and diesel smoke. Above all, I still feel the pride of having been part of something revolutionary, something that changed naval warfare forever. We were boys who became men on those wooden boats, fighting a war we didn't start, but we were determined to finish it. We struck from the shadows because that's where we were strongest, where our speed and surprise gave us the edge. The Japanese learned to fear the darkness they once commanded. They learned that American ingenuity could turn any disadvantage. That is the legacy of the PT boats. Not just the ships sunk or battles won, but proof that free people fighting for freedom can overcome any tyranny. We were small, fast, and deadly. We were secret weapons that stayed secret long enough to turn the tide. We were the Mosquito Fleet that brought down an empire, one torpedo at a time. The Japanese were shocked by America's secret PT boats because they represented everything the Imperial Navy didn't expect from Americans: innovative thinking, aggressive tactics, and a willingness to risk everything on an untested concept. When they finally understood the threat we posed, it was too late. The shadows they once controlled now belonged to us. And from those shadows we struck without mercy until the rising sun set on the Japanese Empire in the Pacific.